Chapter 4 Thunderheart. They made a curious twosome, the great lumbering grizzly with the sun reflecting off the silvery tips of her brown fur, and the small pup, his coat a brighter silver, scampering sometimes ahead of her, sometimes at her side, sometimes behind as they foraged for the spring bulbs that were just pushing their sprouts through the ground. One would grunt and the other would yip or hurl out snappish barks. Yet somehow they had found a way to begin communicating. Faolan had begun to swing his head exactly like a bear cub would when saying no. More and more, the grizzly realized that rearing a pup was not all that different from rearing a cub. She marveled at the similarities between the two. Yet it frightened her how small Faolan was in comparison to bear cubs, small and defenseless. However, the pup was very fast, much faster than a bear cub, and could cover ground with great bursts of speed. The grizzly thought Faolan's speed might compensate for what he lacked in size, but there was the problem of his splayed front paw, which he favored. A wolf, just like a bear, needed full use of all its paws. Faolan now had begun to lag behind and was making small whimpering, "I'm tired" sounds. The grizzly turned around and glared at him. Faolan whimpered and squatted in a hummock of soft grass, wagging his head and growling. "No, no, no," he said, then blew a great spray of air through his nostrils as if to proclaim, "Too hot." He walked slowly forward as if he could hardly drag himself to the grizzly's side and nudged against her to try to clamber onto her back. There was a huge muscle over the grizzly's shoulders that powered her forelimbs, and Faolan loved to climb aboard and ride high on it. Bear cubs were too large to ride at this stage, but not the wolf pup. Even in the den, Faolan liked curling up on that furry mountain when he wasn't nursing. Having mothered 3 sets of cubs, the grizzly had heard all the complaints before, and it really didn't matter if they were bears or wolves. The young got tired, they got cranky, they wanted to go back to the den and nurse. Easy food. But one day the grizzly's milk would dry up, and the pup would have to learn about other sources of food. It was particularly important for Faolan because he was so small. Is he small for his age? Perhaps this is the size of all wolf pups, the grizzly wondered. Nonetheless, it made her nervous. It surprised the grizzly that she had grown so attached to the little one, but that spark she had detected when he had first fetched up on her foot and opened his eyes seemed to kindle throughout his tiny body. He was quick, smart, very strong-willed, and now the fires from the spark sometimes had to be tamed. How could such a tiny little thing contain such fierceness? The grizzly lumbered up to Faolan and butted him with her boxy nose. He tumbled backward, squealing in mock pain. "Get up," she grunted. "No, no." No was most definitely Faolan's favorite word. No, and more milk. It sounded slightly different when he said it than when bear cubs uttered these same words. His voice was higher, not as deep as a cub's. The grizzly wondered if this was because his chest was so much smaller than a bear's. It was so narrow, so fragile. His growls were not only higher, but also more shallow than a cub's. However, the accompanying gestures were very similar to those of a cub. Did the pups of the wolves' packs toss their heads about this way? From what little she had seen of full-grown wolves, their gestures were nothing like these. Once, she had watched a pack from behind a huge boulder as they tore at the carcass of a moose. There was an elaborate formality to their every move. Certain wolves ate first, and then others crept up as if requesting permission to partake of the meat. She wasn't sure how they would deal with a whining, obstreperous pup like Faolan, who had just flopped himself on his back and was flailing his splayed paw dramatically. He wanted to go back to the den, to the cool, welcoming shadows, to its earthy coziness, to the smell of the river, to the soft moss pads that grew at the opening where he loved to take his morning nap. But most of all, He wanted to curl up against the grizzly and nurse. Even the thought of that sweet milk made his stomach growl. Bulbs had a horrible taste. There was no juice in roots. He had even complained that they were too hard for his teeth. He began whining loudly now. "Erskadamus!" The grizzly grumbled the ancient bear oath, which meant curse of a rabid bear. Then she blasted him with a series of short huffs of intolerance. This was the first level of scolding, but Faolan continued to whine and roll on his back, wagging the splayed paw. "Enough of this," she thought. "He must learn not to give in to his weaknesses." He must, she realized suddenly, learn to make them his strengths. It would be a cruel lesson, but there was an even crueler world awaiting him. She growled for the first time ever at the pup, and then with her own mighty paw whacked his good front paw. Now Faolan howled in real pain. His green eyes flooded with astonishment. "How could you? How could you?" he wondered. The grizzly did not have words for every occasion that a young pup would understand. Sometimes teaching or communicating by example was the best way, and then later the words would come. So she lumbered past Faolan and began digging in a patch of onion grass with her own paw, the one she rarely dug with. The message was clear. Use the splayed paw. Make it your digging paw. Meekly, Faolan began to scratch the dirt where the onions grew. It took a long time, but finally he dug one up. The grizzly was proud. She came up beside him, making low purring sounds, then nuzzled him gently and licked Faolan under his jaw with her enormous tongue. She turned and began digging in another nearby patch of onions. Faolan stared at her in dismay. "More?" he thought, but he began scratching with the splayed paw. He did not want to risk her wrath again. What would hurt more than a whack was if she said he could not nurse. "No milk, only onions? Unthinkable!" He dug harder. The pup had done well. The grizzly had watched him out of the corner of her eye. In a very short time, he had turned the splayed paw in a special way so that he could get nearly the force he had with the other paw. Faolan was a quick learner, and not just quick, but inventive. Still, the grizzly constantly regretted that she knew so little about wolves. But bears and wolves tended to avoid one another. This was quite different from the owls and the wolves, who had formed a close alliance over a great span of time that reached back to when the wolves had first arrived in the beyond. The grizzly often thought that if she had been an owl, she would have been a better mother to this pup, but it was stupid to waste time regretting that she was not an owl. Instead, she thought and thought, searching for every scrap of memory she had of wolves. She vividly remembered once watching from a high promontory two packs that had come together to hunt. She had been quick to see that the way wolves hunted was very different from that of bears. Bears were much larger and more powerful, but wolves made up for their lack of power with their clever ways. Bears never formed packs, and perhaps because of that they had a different manner of thinking. The wolves' ways seemed complicated and mysterious. And owls, the grizzly continued her musing, owls are so clever. They knew how to make tools, weapons. They stuck things in the fires of their forges and made claws that fit over their talons. Perhaps, she thought suddenly, bears weren't so smart because they were so much bigger than wolves and so much bigger than owls. Then a really dreadful thought occurred to her. Perhaps I am not smart enough to rear a wolf pup. She looked back at the poor little thing as they made their way to the den. He was completely exhausted, wobbly to the point of staggering off the narrow path. He was most likely too tired to even cling to her hump while riding. Well, she thought, smart or dumb, I'm all he's got. She turned around and picked the little pup up with his head in her mouth and the rest of his body dangling, the way she would have carried a 1-moon-old cub. At least 2 moons had passed since Faolan had fetched up, and he was still small enough to be carried carefully in her mouth. Tomorrow, they would make their way an even longer distance to forage for the squirrel caches of white bark pine. The white bark that squirrels use to line their nests was one of the most nutritious of the foods available in spring, and with luck, perhaps they would find a squirrel. The spring diet was mostly grasses, roots, nuts. Meat would come later, but they could always hope for carrion of an old animal who had not made it through the winter. Even as the grizzly led the pup back to the den, she swung her head constantly to sniff, scanning for the distinctive smell of rotting flesh. The grizzly had found a new den for spring and summer, one of the loveliest ever. It was in a thicket of alders on the river near a back eddy that would soon be busy with trout. Just outside the den's entrance, glacier lilies nodded their pale yellow heads. The steep bank down to the river was stippled with wild blue irises. By the time they entered the den, Faolan was asleep, but he never slept so soundly that he couldn't nurse. The grizzly sat upright with her legs stuck straight out in front of her. While Faolan nursed, she watched the lavender twilight fall softly on the land. The river reflected the clouds on its glassy surface. It was different from the stormy night Faolan had arrived. She looked down at the pup, who was drunk with milk now. She wondered about him more and more. The splayed paw was not that odd, but the faint tracery of swirling lines on the pad intrigued her. The swirls were so dim, but there was something almost hypnotic about the pattern of lines. What did it mean? Where had Faolan come from? Why had the river given him up to her? Was he lonely? Wolves were pack animals. Bears solitary. How could she be not just a mother, but an entire pack to this wolf? "Erska Damas," she muttered quietly. The grizzly wondered all sorts of things. She knew wolves could not sit up like bears, so they must nurse their young in a very different way, perhaps lying down. But she was always worried about rolling over and crushing Faolan accidentally. He was so small and she so huge. And wolves could not stand up on their hind legs, let alone sit up. This seemed especially unfortunate. She saw so much standing up. She learned so much. It troubled her that Faolan could not do this. Would it, she wondered, be possible to teach a wolf to stand up and walk just a bit on his hind legs? She might try it. She looked down at him again and gave him a cuddle and a nuzzle. She loved him so. It was very odd, she knew. Other bears would look at her suspiciously, but she didn't care. She simply didn't care. Faolan squirmed a bit and settled deeper down into his milk-laced sleep. He had grown accustomed to the percussive sounds of the grizzly's innards, the windy drafts of her gut as she digested, the bellowing inhalations and exhalations of her breathing, but most of all, the epic thumpings of her heart. That huge, majestic heart. The sound wove through Faolan while he slept like a song for his milk dreams. The grizzly was no longer simply the milk giver in his mind, but Thunderheart.